Thank you for joining us tonight. This is Museums, the podcast talking about diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. I am your host, Marshall Morgan. Joining me is one of my friends and activist, Ava Fox. Hi, Ava. How are you doing tonight?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me on. Been
Yeah,
wanting
thanks
to
so
be
much for
on
joining us.
museums for a long time now.
Well, it's always great to have one of our fans and one of my friends being here.
First time,
So,
long time.
why don't we start off for all of the listeners at home? Why don't you give a little bit of your background, in your activist movements and groups?
So it basically all started with being in a band with a huge dingus. um, and after not wanting uh, kind of abusers in the scene, and after seeing like other kind of brave people coming out and sharing their stories and kind of outing the people that we don't want in our scene anymore, I decided to kind of share my story. And then I just kind of continuously tried to stand up for the scene, and we're trying to make it more diverse and like more safe, just in general, for anybody who's not straight white men, because everything is already safe for straight white men constantly. So yeah.
Well, kind of going off of that, so uh, as you know, as a longtime listener, in museums, the point is we're talking about diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion in different museum settings. So we're going to start off a little bit, just kind of asking you some questions about your experiences with museums. So if you are able to recall, do you know how old you were the first time you went to a museum?
I was probably really little. Probably like around 12. I think it was like a museum in Mesa. Was
Mm.
it, like, I remember there was dinosaurs, and then I think I went to, like, I think there were paintings, and plus my mom is an artist, and she she was uh acquaintances with this lady who like owns her own museum. So like I would go to her museum um when like my mom had shows. And she doesn't have like that many shows, but like, you know. Yeah. Artsy museums.
Okay, so you're then how you have a lot of familiarity with the art museums. Kind of going down other paths. What about history museums, for instance? Do you have any experience with history museums, or have you ever been to one or anything kind of like that?
Does like, because I know my school went on a field trip once where it was like, these are the pilgrims and we made like butter.
Mhm.
Does
Yeah,
that
no, that
count as
definitely
like a
counts.
museum? Because I think that was like the earliest museum that I've like, actually answering your last question. I think that was the
Mm,
earliest, which was like in like fifth or sixth grade.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that would definitely count as a form of museums because I mean the big thing about museums is museums are meant to be institutions that anyone can go to and engage with different topics that are there, whether it's art and you're engaging with the art and talking about what the art's portraying, different types of histories, different types of sciences and technologies. Like so, something like that definitely would be a type of museum. It's also like just kind of a really cool thing. Like I definitely enjoy the living history museums. I think those are really fun.
Oh yeah, yeah. Those, it was definitely really cool as a kid. I think like
Yeah,
there was like ships in there too. Just
nice.
all things, yeah, all things kids like.
So, kind of a next question for you. You know, talking about museums in general, often we just think of items being like presented, whether it's art in galleries, or, objects or items being put on exhibit. Um, but another big thing about museums is museums, kind of going back to what I previously stated, they're places for engaging with topics and for discussions, but also for representing an active and being activists for change. because the actual information they're being presented is being presented for the community, is being presented for the public. So with that in mind, I wanted to ask you if you have any kind of experiences or knowledge about diversity, equity, accessibility, or inclusion with museums.
Um, I I don't think so. I I honestly think my experience with museums have been relatively passive
Mm.
and relatively like show and tell, but with little to no information about. I mean, like they have like those little descriptors, but it's not like I've seen that outreach to the community, that I'm sure
Yeah.
was like I don't know because I'm not like a museum expert, but like if it was like the initial intention to like talk, like create a discussion in the community. um I think it's because my perception of museums almost stems from prestige, like everybody who's knowledge, like who's cultured,
Yeah.
goes to museums because they have the time and money to do so.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah,
Yeah.
no.
Well, actually, I think you like right there. You just made like some of the great points about museum flaws. Um, so kind of talking about like museums, like museums usually are for the people who have the time, the resources to actually go to these museums, and that's why you see that at times there's not this initial community outreach. Um, that's one of the most fatal flaws for museums is that a lot of people don't feel that museums are for them. They don't feel represented in museums as the exhibits are being portrayed. They don't interpret different cultural narratives or difficult histories. Um, and the museums that do often don't have the same recognition or they don't have the same portrayal that they should if they were actually working with community members to find out what the community would want implemented in the
Mhm.
museums. Um, so I think those points you've made, like they're completely valid, and it's one of the, I would say, fatal flaws with museums in the past and still current museums. However, one of the bright sides is there are definitely a lot of museums that are creating new programs and trying to change their mission to you know have more of community outreach. One museum, for instance, is the Wing Luke Museum. Um, have you ever heard of the Wing Luke Museum?
I don't think so.
Okay, yeah. So I had not heard about it either until I actually took a class at Arizona State called History 45. In that class, I had the opportunity to learn that the Wing Luke Museum, they've actually been one of the front runners in implementing diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion because they started doing community involvement programs. So they're having community members come in and actually be part of the exhibit decision making process, and they're actually having more of a cultural impact and cultural representation, which is then having more visitors come, and it's just benefiting the museum, the economy, and overall the discussion that's occurring.
Oh, that sounds actually really cool. Kind of like
Yeah,
they're trying to make like a grassroots movement, like in a lab almost. Trying to,
yeah,
like including the community in something they'd want to participate in.
yeah. So kind of talking about that, if looking back at the museums here in Mesa in the Valley, if these museums were to reach out more to communities such as your own, do you think that you would be more interested in wanting to actually go to museums to learn more about them and to be involved with them?
Most definitely. And like I come from a musical background. A
Mhm.
lot of the like the way I see the world comes from a musical lens. So like this discussion in my brain is being applied to the music scene. Um and it's funny because there is like a really big music museum in Mesa or Phoenix
Oh,
somewhere. It's
wow.
like the musical history museum here,
Mhm.
and I think it's like famous. Um, because it has a lot of like traditional, it has like traditional instruments and all of that cool jazz that you can like play,
Nice.
which is kind of like a form of, it is a form of kind of like interaction between the museum and like the visitor. However, like in the music scene, it's not like a place to go, really. Like it's just kind of like, oh yeah, have you been? Sure, it's pretty neat, or whatever. So like back to your question, like if they held shows there, I think
Mhm.
people would definitely go often, and like
Yeah.
would definitely feel more relaxed in that space, because I feel like
Mhm.
museums is like no touch, be quiet kind of, generally, which
Yeah.
kind of eludes the whole like connection. It really puts up like a wall between the community and art, or the community and history. So yeah, I definitely think that having more programs to try to like invest in the community, or like trying to get kind of like connections with the community um would definitely work out, or I think it would like shift in some way how we view museums.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, I think you leave us in a great spot to jump off to our next point on museums trying to become more diverse or inclusive. Um, so this is gonna be kind of be a little game show, best way I can phrase it. So I'm gonna give you a statistic. I'm gonna ask you some questions. There will be multiple choice, and I just want you to, answer freely. Okay.
Okay.
So approximately 1/3 of the U.S. population is a racial minority, and every year this percent is increasing annually as there is a decrease in the population of the white museum visitors, we should say. So when taking this into account for the museum settings, what percentage of racial minorities do you believe are the core visitors of museums? Do you think it is 9%, 13%, 22%, or 35%?
I think it's 9%. I think it's the
9%.
lowest percent.
The lowest of them. So yeah, you would be absolutely right. It is on an average national basis, museums have reported that only 9% of their total visitor count is some type of racial minority, or they identify as part of a minority group. Um, this just kind of highlights what you were talking about previously about how communities, they aren't really getting involved because they don't feel like the museums are, actually meant for them. They don't feel included. They don't feel that there's the narratives there. So yeah, 9%. It's extremely low.
Shocking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then kind of follow up to that. Um, what percent of museum employees do you believe are minorities? In this, I'm just gonna leave you to guess.
Just to guess.
Yep.
What is it, 9% again? Or dude, it's got to be more.
Okay,
It's
think it's
got to
more? Okay.
be like the majority. It's got to be that weird balance between the white people looking and everybody else working. It's got to
So
be weirdly supremacist.
so if you had to throw out a guess, what percent do you think it would be then?
70%.
70%. So, unfortunately, it is not 70%. It would be great if it was that high. And the point you make is completely valid.
Oh,
It
dude,
does
are they just
seem,
not being?
yeah, they're not being really included. So the
So,
actual percent of minorities who are considered museum employees is merely 20% on
oh,
average.
I completely
Yeah.
flipped it. Oh, okay.
Yeah. And that 20% being as low as it is kind of ties back to the actual stories and the items that are being talked about in museums, because, you know, there are people who are definitely advocating and they are wanting this diversity and inclusion in museums, but when there's only like 20% of the employees who are actually part of these minority groups, it's kind of hard to have that representation and that understanding of what the communities actually might want.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Like, oh wow. I wish it was 70% now.
Oh man, I do too.
That'd be cool.
Honestly, it would be. Yeah, but no, 9 and 20%, and that's going back just to racial minorities. Then
Right.
there's so many other types of groups that are not included. You know, if it's the LGBTQ plus groups, groups who are on the autistic spectrum, groups that are part of multiple identities, because, you know, there's people who are part of the different minority groups. A lot of these groups are not being included also in exhibits. Here at the Arizona Historical Society, based in Tempe, they actually had some controversy when they created a exhibit that was meant to portray women in the valley and the feminist movement. You know, it's trying to be more inclusive. It's trying to actually highlight this history that's not normally told. And they got so much actual negative feedback. The exhibit had to change. They still do have elements that are being portrayed, but they like had you know, museum members, for instance, right? The people who actually, you know, they pay to have these these annual memberships. So many people write in, harass the curator just because they did not want these histories to be told. And that's just one example. There's so many other examples here in Arizona and just nationally.
So like, oh wow, that's disappointing.
Yeah.
Because like the museum community is trying their hardest not to be inclusive. Like, is that what I'm hearing?
At times, like it really depends. So, like the case of you know, here in Arizona, at the Historical Society, they have museum members who are advocating for the inclusion and diversity, but then you have their higher ups, like the board members, who are against it, or then just like their annual members. So, like the annual members who are typically going back to that cisgender white male, who are the ones against it, because it's not the correct, true history that should be told.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, dude, they always have to mess things up.
Yeah, honestly.
Having the same issues in the music scene right now.
Yeah. But I think so, kind of going through the music scene and the museum scene, a way to, I'm not going to say, you know, fix or solve the issues that are there, because it's going to take a lot of work to fix or actually solve these issues. But
come at it different angles.
that's the thing. You have to come at it and they have to start acting. So museums and the museum decision makers, it's critical that they start supporting, you know, the actual work being done by history workers, by curators who want to create diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion in museums. And then in addition, they need to have the community representation. You know, if communities are still going to be neglected, then they're not going to want to actually go to the museums. They're not going to be involved. And with this, you know, growing, you know, population of minorities, as we talked about previously, in a couple of decades, you know, majority of the U.S. is going to be a minority, a racial minority. And at that point, if museums have not adapted, then they're just going to become history.
Yeah, the history museums are going to become history.
Exactly.
Yeah, they almost have to become diverse to survive, and like becoming diverse is ultimately like that's what's going to make the most money. And like there's this it's kind of weird because I feel like people look at museums as almost a source of history and like almost like data, you know. I'm bringing up Indiana Jones, you know, where where like that kind of makes people think about museums in a certain light. So the fact that actual history isn't being represented like as reality is, you know,
Yeah.
is kind of scary because it promotes misinformation and colonialism, and and I definitely think that museums would definitely make a good part of the community if they were done right, and if they were centered in the community and centered in facts and inclusion. And I think they would do really well because people really are searching for something to be prideful, like to pride themselves in. I think especially right now. So because
Yeah.
like learning history right now, like relearning history, because I think we all are trying to kind of shake the mistruths that we were taught in school.
Yeah.
So learning like real history and like other things to be proud of, things that merit being proud of, is very important for museums to kind of search for and present with pride and give something that people can really latch on to, you know.
Yeah.
And that absolutely has to be something diverse. Like this can't be another like white guy's savior of
Yeah.
like a white guy's like cultural savior of like, oh no, we're not all that bad. It's got to be centered in the reality, which is definitely gonna have to gonna be diverse and gonna be because that's reality, and diversity is based in reality. Absolutely.
I 100% agree with you there.
Oh.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that, museums are just, I don't know. It's hard to believe that there's so many complex issues that are plaguing the museum, kind of the system right now, whether it's art, history. I would say depressing, specific and format, just because museums have the capability of being places that actually help communities. They help advocate for change, but right now they're, just being places that are often portraying items that fuel the white man's ego.
Yo, that is insane because that is exactly the exact description that I would like describe as like the music scene.
Yeah.
Right? It's something that should be a place of creativity, of expression, of freedom. And oftentimes people who don't fit a really narrow margin of person, of humanity, they get herded out. And it's so like everything about it is so hypocritical and hilarious. But it does real harm.
Yeah.
It does real harm, and like when you stroke the white man, like white people in general, because like white women are no better when it comes to like white ego and what like but definitely like there has been a lot of ways that people can get hurt and just white guys kind of scoot by because that's kind of how the system was built. Um, but honestly, right now, I'm seeing like kind of a shift, and like I don't know if you're seeing a similar shift in museums right now, because you were mentioning that they're trying to be diverse amidst kind of, so like it's been struggling, right?
Yeah. No, there definitely is like a shift, but it's one that it needs help to actually become
Definitely.
successful.
I think it's like an idea. Like
Yeah.
I think it's an idea, and like seeing that idea should have been reality all along.
Yeah.
Right? And that's, I think I have high hopes for that. At least in the music scene, and I think I can relate to the museums a little bit more because it correlates with art. you know,
Yeah.
there's art museums, but I think like history can also be a form of art. And like, I mean, history of art, it
Yeah.
all, art takes from history. It's all interconnected, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Very true.
so honestly, that's really interesting to me that like these two systems are going through this change and going
Yeah.
through like almost like an awakening um, of the people who know that they should be represented the most,
Yeah.
and being like, well, we have to make this true to
Yeah.
protect us. And yeah, the music community right now is waning. like like everybody is turning out to be terrible people, and it's usually the white guys
Mhm.
or like the white people in general who are terrible. So, but I think that's good. Kind of like burn it down and rise from the ashes to something new.
Yeah. I mean, that goes with the museums are not representative movement. Um, just there needs to be changes in the museum system, in the music system, and just in the US and human systems.
Oh, absolutely.
Humans need to treat humans with respect, and no one should be, judged based on the color of their skin, based on their sexual preferences, based on anything about them. The only things that we should be judged on is our morals and our characters.
Yeah, like absolutely, like
Yeah.
100%. I- and it's honestly the dumbest thing that hasn't been our staple.
Mhm.
It's the most mundane differences. It's like uh the butter up and butter down wars from like Dr.
Yeah.
Seuss.
I think that's a perfect analogy for what it is.
Yeah, humanity is disappointing on so many levels and then amazing on so many levels
Yeah.
because they face that disappointment like champions when they don't have to, or like yeah. I hope that our social system in general
Mhm.
is being affected by these little ripples with like the music scene and with like the museum scene, and like hopefully it'll kind of break through to the larger mechanics of the overlying system.
100%.
And I have hopes for it. It just seems gray right now.
Yeah,
But
I
just
definitely
gotta,
agree with you
yeah,
about that.
hold on to those good people. And there's more
Yeah.
than you would think. Yeah.
So, with that being said, before we do wrap up the podcast, as we do every week with the podcast, we're going to leave our tips for the industry. So,
Tips for the industry. I love this segment.
yeah, if you want, I'll let you start off with your tips for the music industry, and then I will give my tips for the history, and we'll wrap it up.
Cool. I think I think the music industry, like, no show is better than a house show, right? No show that was kind of thrown by an outsider is ever a good show, because usually we're like outside in like a windy environment with nothing, just everything is terrible, right? So my point being is you want something, you got to do it. And when it comes from the bottom up, that's when it's good. That's when it's art. That's when that's when stuff stays, I think.
Yeah,
And it's kind of has to be like widespread when talking about like a whole social like change. um so yeah, like support the people who are speaking about the people who are a threat to the scene, you know.
mm,
And I think a lot of people haven't been paying a lot of attention to these, to the the DIY underneath the DIY, like the underground under the underground, which are like the diverse people who are a forefront of music, and the white people, and like usually it's the white men who come and steal it from them and then get all the glory. So like credit has to be given to the forefronts, and has to be given to the people who deserve it. And once you focus on what you want in the scene, then it has no choice than to follow.
Yeah,
I
that's
hope
a
that got through.
great way to. I think honestly, I think that was a great way to actually phrase everything and wrap everything up. Yeah. And then my tips for the museum field. Start off for any listener, as a museum visitor, as someone who's, thought about visiting a museum but chose not to because they didn't feel represented. The change and the time for change is now. Be an activist for diversity, be an activist for equity, be an activist for accessibility and inclusion. Because if we, as the public, as the communities, as the ones who actually visit museums, are not being activists, words, right? Are not being activists for change, then change won't happen. Museums have the potential to be amazing places. But if we allow them to be oppressive, and if we allow them to avoid telling histories and, minority narratives, then it will continue to be the same thing it's been for the last 200 years. And then for any museum official, any board member, anyone who actually has I'm not going to say the power, because the public does have the power, but for anyone who has the ability to actually make those, institutional changes, these are the tips. First, involve communities. As long as communities are, oppressed and they're not included, they're not going to want to visit museums. So include them in the decision making, include them in different events. It was it was the Native American Heritage Month this past month. Have events for them. Invite different types of the tribes that were actually originally in this area to present their art, to present their histories, to present their culture, because it's the easiest way to actually help the community learn and grow, and to help the institution do the same. Second thing, hire more people of minority representation. Ava talked about it earlier, 70%. That's going to be the goal. That's going to be the goal. So 5 years, 70%. It has to happen.
Chop chop.
Yeah, 20%. It's so low. It's so low. And then, that just ties in with the 9% of, racial minorities who actually visit museums. The US is changing. And if museums don't change, they're going to be left in the past. So with that being said, thank you so much for joining us tonight, Ava.
Thank you so much. Make your own museums, make your own shows. Yeah.
And thank you to everyone for listening. As always, this is Museums, the podcast dedicated to discussing diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. Join us next week, and we will be discussing the history of museums and colonialism. Thank you, and have a great rest of your night. Bye, everyone.
See ya.